The deal is dead. In passing the state transportation budget, lawmakers put the brakes on the sale of the agency's old building. It was a controversial maneuver, and one that has many legislative leaders worried about their blind spot. One of those leaders, Senate Pro Tem Chuck Winder, explains why he voted down that budget every time he had the chance. We hear his thoughts on why budget writers overstep their authority at the possible expense of the state's reputation. Lawmakers consider hundreds of bills every legislative session. Some survive, most don't. But how many are actually homegrown? And who writes them? It is not officially over, but we are in that phase of waiting for the sound and fury of the second session of the 67th Idaho Legislature to settle. And of course, we're also in that phase of wait and see what the governor does with those last-minute bills that were sent to his office. One of the final items, whether to allow the sale of the old Idaho Transportation Department campus in Boise to go final. After weeks of debates and backroom maneuvers, lawmakers officially killed that real estate deal by approving the agency's budget last night. Those who voted for the budget say they think they could get more money for the land later. Those who voted against it say a committee shouldn't meddle in policy, especially the sale of a property already agreed upon. There was a lot that went on over the course of the 87 days, and especially over the last couple of days to send the House and Senate to recess. Joe Paris breaks it down.
Let's start on March 20th with House Bill 723. This would be the original allocation for the ITD budget for the year, and it also did include language that revoked the permission to basically sell the State Street campus. Idaho lawmakers, they had some problems with it. So House Bill 723, it actually passed the full Idaho House by one vote.
When we broke everything out and we looked at everything and we looked at the cost aspect, this was a better option. This is where we were going to actually have the potential to save additional tax money.
So 723 headed back over to the Idaho Senate. 8 days later, on March 28th, 723, it fails, 16-19 in the Senate, mostly because those against the idea didn't like the concept of going back on a deal.
If we overturn the board decision with this budget, we're saying that you can't trust the word of the state of Idaho, and I don't think we want to do that. That's why I'll be voting against this budget.
A number of days later, April 2nd, another new piece of legislation is drafted. That's Senate Bill 1461. It's essentially exactly the same as House Bill 723, but you may notice the final budget had $100 less in it to basically make this technically a different piece of legislation. So the next day, April 3rd, legislation passes out of the Budgeting Committee, JFAC, with a do-pass recommendation for both houses. But Senate Bill 1461 suddenly got stuck in the Senate yesterday afternoon.
President rules that the bill is not in order.
Concerns about it being a copy-paste with no real differences in it, essentially meaning you would get to vote on the same legislation twice, one that was already defeated.
A bill having precisely the same title and subject as the one previously rejected by the House, that's small h, may be refused for introduction.
So after some legislative protocols and some fact-checking and some rule-checking, Idaho lawmakers said Senate Bill 1461 in the Senate, it wasn't going to happen.
We are ready for business. Ms. Otto, please, let's go to ITD budget setting.
The Joint Finance and Appropriation Committee once again met to draft another budget, this time House Bill 770. But still, skeptics had the same problems with it.
Earlier this session, it was made very clear that this is a budget committee, not a policy committee, and yet here we are ramming a piece of policy into a budget.
Senator, I think we have established and have a legal opinion that this is perfectly legal to have in here. It directs use of the funding and is fiscal policy.
Madam Chairman, legal opinions grow on trees in this building, so.
House Bill 770 was essentially, again, the same as House Bill 723 and Senate Bill 1461. This one, though, had $200 less in it than the original appropriation.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, this is the bill we've all been waiting for.
House Bill 770 passed the Idaho House pretty convincingly in this conversation, 37-31.
I think it gives the best value to the taxpayers of Idaho.
The Idaho House then decided that they're going to recess until next week, basically putting the ball in the court of the Senate to figure out if they were going to extend the session, killing the legislation, or would they be agreeable.
Senators,
I think we all know what this bill is.
Late into the evening on Wednesday, House Bill 770, it passed narrowly.
The vote count shows 18 in favor with 17 against. Majority having voted in the affirmative. House Bill number 770 is passed the Senate.
So the final thing in play here, Brian, is that it is sitting on the governor's desk, and at this point at 5:03 on Thursday, we have not heard if the governor has signed, veto, or is still thinking about it.
Okay, so the crux of this is whether or not this sale for this ITD campus in the building on State Street is going to go final. What about the people who actually are trying to buy it? What do they have to say about this?
Well, they're clearly frustrated, and they don't think that it should have gone down this way. And I got a statement from them earlier today basically saying so much, but I want to go back to a March 21st letter that was basically written to the state of Idaho from the group that wanted to buy it, and they basically said that we hope that it won't be the case, that the sale is blocked, and they look forward to ongoing productive cooperation, but they do say that basically if the code isn't enforced in a way that they read it, basically undoing a deal, that they might look into legal options in terms of what's happening here, because as it's highlighted, it's not like they just showed up 6 weeks ago and said, hey, we'd like to buy the campus.
Right.
This has been going on for years.
Yeah. Okay, so there also, you mentioned all the procedural issues that went on with this bill and getting to this point, but there could be another snag that's involved with this, right? When it comes to procedure and how it got through.
Yeah. I think you get a situation where the Idaho Senate was hoping to, pass the legislation. It got stuck into JFAC,
right.
And there was this letter that was written that was basically saying you can't run the same legislation twice, which is interesting, Brian, because lawmakers pointed out we've done this before.
Yeah.
The real difference between yesterday and previously is that somebody in the Idaho Senate said, no, we shouldn't do this, I'm protesting. Whereas in the past, in the Idaho State House, basically rerunning the same bill with a little bit of a dollar difference, it's been allowed to go because, as the Lieutenant Governor explained as he was running the Senate floor, no one objected previously.
But maybe there is an objection?
Sounds like there is.
We'll see. All right, thank you, Joe. Okay, so this reversal of this sale goes back to before the session started, as we mentioned. It's been going on for a couple years. Not the reversal, but the actual trying to sell it. But this reversal, though, wasn't soon enough for some. We're told members of JFAC took a tour of the old ITD building last fall. It was then, apparently, they decided the building, outdated, water damaged, all of that went with it, didn't seem that bad. So they started thinking of reapportioning money to try and put ITD back into that building instead of selling it. Senator Kevin Cook said on the Senate floor last week, between 53 new employees over 5 years, keeping the Magic Valley office in Shoshone instead of moving it to Twin Falls, and by keeping the State Street building and paying the $30 million to refurbish it, well, that would ultimately save the state $110 million. Senator Cook said this, by the way, on March 28th, 10 days after the buyers had already signed the contract, which is where Senate Pro Tem says, Chuck Winder says he had a problem. ITD followed a process established by law and negotiated a deal by good faith, he says. And that's why he says this budget was a bad idea.
If anyone can show me where JFAC or any other committee has the right to, with intent language, override the laws of the state of Idaho, show me where. And somebody asked me, is this a hill you want to die on? This is a hill I want to die on if I have to.
Today,
I didn't die on it, but I'm bleeding from it, let's put it that way.
After a late Wednesday session to finally pass the budget, Senate Pro Tem Chuck Winder explains his no vote.
I've been very consistent with that.
For the Transportation Services Division,
by saying JFAC's job should only be to appropriate money.
And shouldn't be overturning 2 years planning and movement within the process of disposing of the property. People felt that JFAC was making a policy in their appropriation bill, which they didn't feel was appropriate, that they were going beyond their authority as a joint committee. Just felt like it was one of those things where it was just in the bottom of the ninth and it was too late to really cut it off. Now the other people felt like they didn't have an actual signed contract.
this one is from FJ Management Incorporated. The next page, which is the last page, is empty.
But the state still hasn't signed it and won't now because the legislature directed them to kill it.
Do you think the state's reputation is hurt?
I hope not, but I would guess it is to some extent. How broad? I don't know that it's a broad hurt.
Senator Winder believes the hurt might come from the precedent set by a committee overstepping its bounds when the state already gave an agency the authority to do its business.
Right.
and now the legislature, or at least the budgeting part of the legislature, saying we don't think that you did it properly.
Well, no, they haven't said that.
Right, yes.
They just got to the end of the sale and said, we don't think they got as much money as they should have. It isn't as good a deal as I thought it was going to be. The property was appraised at $38 million. They got $52 million for it.
Seems like a good deal.
Seems like a pretty good deal to me, but the choice was made. I mean, it was just by a few votes in the House. Over here was one vote different. So it's just kind of that tension, and it's a natural tension. The founders of our country wanted it that way, and so that's how it plays out. Sometimes it's sausage making, and sometimes it's you make a nice filet.
Sometimes it's a burger. ITD budget is now with the governor for his consideration, as we mentioned. The Senate and House are both in recess. Should the governor veto this bill, then Senator Winder says they'll have some more work to do before they adjourn sine die. If he signs it, that will officially kill this deal. And as you heard from Joe and the buyers, and Winder told us today, he believes the state will get sued.
This isn't a problem, but there's model legislation out there for it, and they're bringing it in here, and unfortunately a lot of it's passing.
Do you think it's important that constituents know who is supporting the bills, who exactly is supporting the bills that you're pitching on their behalf?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think that would be wise, right? If we could know that. I mean, again, I think if some of the lawmakers don't even know that, it'd be hard to get that information out, but I do think that would be really healthy.
There were 634 bills introduced in the State House this session, between the House and the Senate, most of them from the House side. That doesn't even include the dozens of resolutions, joint resolutions, proclamations, and memorials. And that's a lot of moving around the Capitol building. How many of those do you think are unique? We got this question from David a couple weeks ago when we were talking about requiring petitioners to tell if they are being paid. Transparency in petitions, he says, asks. How about transparency in legislation as to who writes the bill and how much that costs? Can anyone say ALEC? Well, David's right. ALEC, or the American Legislative Exchange Council, is one of the bill mills that kicks out legislation for states to copy. Even those bills pitched as being unique and good for Idaho aren't actually original or driven by constituent demand. These model bills, as they're called, mostly come from out of state, and they often directly benefit a handful of special interests, like huge corporations. Well, these groups push the same policies in capitals across the country, and in recent years, many of those special interests have leaned very far to the right. Here's Morgan Romero.
First order of business, roll call.
Senate will come to orders.
Many of the bills introduced in Idaho's State House
House is a quorum and is ready to do business.
don't originate there.
House Bill 419.
Senate Bill 1252.
House Bill 620.
House Bill 599.
House Bill 689.
Senate Bill 1245.
They don't even originate in the state.
This bill is crafted so well.
Every legislative session, several are copied and pasted from think tanks, lobbyists, and corporate-backed national special interests.
Groups dubbed bill mills.
First order of business, roll call.
These groups often pitch lawmakers bills before the legislative session, sometimes at conferences.
Does it make things easier, like you don't have to reinvent the wheel?
This existed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When Boise attorney Steve Scanlon and lobbyist Russell Westerberg served in the legislature more than 4 decades ago.
For some of those folks, it's an easier access. It's a cheaper place to do business.
When politics didn't seem as partisan. Being a part-time citizen legislature, some lawmakers tell me it's more efficient and effective to be handed model legislation than draft up their own bills from scratch.
Is model legislation, from your perspective, inherently a good thing, a bad thing, or does it just depend?
Depends on your viewpoint. You know, that's years ago, that's where we got land use planning from. Years ago, that's where we got kindergartens from. So, you know, there's been model legislation in many ways has served Idaho and its constituency well.
But today, with politics so polarized, does model legislation serve Idahoans well?
Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing.
Depends who you ask.
They're dinking around doing this bizarre stuff. And it's a lot of solutions in search of a problem that doesn't exist in Idaho.
And it definitely depends on the legislation.
You've seen that it is working in other places, and it can benefit Idaho. We should bring ideas like that here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Republican Representatives Jordan Redmond and Brandon Mitchell have introduced or co-sponsored model bills.
Yes, yep, I have.
Sometimes leaning on the Legislative Services Office to tweak them.
If we get model legislation and it's already been through the court system, then we know it's constitutional. Makes it easy.
In the 2024 session, 7 investigates found Idaho lawmakers pitched at least a dozen model bills. A handful went on to pass both houses this session and even become law.
Like an amendment to state law allowing safe haven sites where people can leave their babies to use baby boxes.
House Bill 620 as amended by State Affairs Committee regarding knives.
Or a bill barring cities and counties from regulating where you can bring knives.
We have the world's best military.
Copy and paste legislation that drove contentious debate cropped up too, including the Defend the Guard Act.
This bill is ripe with political agendas and deceptive overtones.
And a Senate bill shielding pesticide manufacturers from certain liabilities, supported by Bayer, the manufacturer of Roundup. Then there was copycat legislation in a category of its own.
I do think a lot of the bills we've taken up this year are social issues, for sure.
Social issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion, transgender care, ballot harvesting, pronouns and sex and gender definitions, books in libraries. Take Senator Brian Lenny's bill, for example, trying to get rid of DEI offices at Idaho higher ed institutions. While Lenny claimed it was custom, 7 investigates discovered it was copied and pasted from the Manhattan Institute, a conservative New York think tank that rakes in tens of millions of dollars from undisclosed donors each year.
It is my pleasure to bring to you today House Bill 421.
Republican Representatives Julianne Young and Bruce Skog sponsored model legislation, which passed the Senate Tuesday despite strong opposition.
It creates an unsafe space, a more unsafe space for my community, but it creates an unsafe space for all women.
Changing sex and gender definitions in Idaho code.
I've had input both from the Heritage Foundation and from ADF.
They filled in the blanks on a bill from the Heritage Foundation, a highly influential right-wing think tank backed by more than $100 million each year in dark money intended to influence public policy. As a nonprofit, like most think tanks, Heritage Foundation doesn't have to disclose its donors.
These procedures and medical interventions carry substantial risks.
Also from Young and Skog, also based off model legislation, a new law banning the use of public money for transgender care.
It simply answers the question of whether we believe it is an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars.
Lawmakers copied it from Do No Harm, an advocacy organization claiming to protect health care from identity politics.
I think some of the issues that we're taking on now is actually preemption issues, right? Like getting in front of things because you do see what's happening in other parts of the country.
There's some real issues out there that I think get ignored because of the distraction of the more emotional issues.
Critics of some of these bill mills say invented issues detract from real ones.
We don't need this. It's not anything that we need to be addressing. But they make it sound like it's a big problem.
And the, quote, solutions these groups peddle benefit them.
There's an agenda behind them.
Not Idahoans. Although the same can be said about many model bills.
It follows the money. And there's a lot of money in that. And so they have all these resources to go to come up with all this crazy, wacky legislation you see.
Do you think it's important that you as a lawmaker know exactly who is behind these bills?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think that's very important to kind of have an idea on who's behind that bill. You know, and that's something that can kind of get lost in the in the shuffle of things.
But ultimately, Redmond and Mitchell feel the contents and language of a bill are more important than where it comes from.
As long as the bill does what it needs to do, I think that's the important part.
And this is not unique to the Republican Party in America. Progressive and liberal special interest groups pitch model legislation to Democrats as well. Although with our Republican-dominated legislature, it's not as common in Idaho. The prevalence of model legislation, Brian, is actually really hard to quantify. I found that during my research because a lot of times the text of a bill may not be copied and pasted. It may not be identical or mirror something from one of these groups, but the idea itself is copied.
I was going to ask you about the line in there about follow the money. How easy is it to kind of track who's paying for these bills, these lobbyists?
You know, it really depends. That's something we didn't totally dive down. We talked about it with the pesticide bill, but what I did for this story was look up Form 990s, how much money these massive national organizations, these think tanks, are garnering and what we call dark money. I talked about that, but that's a whole other story that we can definitely dive into, is looking into exactly, like Bayer, what companies and people are spending money on what bills in Idaho.
Exactly. All right. Super interesting. Thanks, Morgan.
You bet.
Strong downpours and thunderstorms moving through southern Idaho tonight. This is the view from St. Alphonsus in Nampa. You can see a lot of that view shrouded by heavy rainfall that we're seeing right now on the radar. But one thing we haven't seen in Treasure Valley spots, western Treasure Valley spots, has been the lightning. But you can see just how high some of these precipitation rates are with the reds and the oranges on the radar. But a lot of that lightning and more energetic parts of the storm have been more to the east, passing over Mountain Home. So as we look to how much of the moisture is passing over the Boise area, you can see it's a little bit on the lower side, and a lot more of those lightning strikes have been to the east. However, we did hear a rumble of thunder here at the KTVB studios, but that happened about 15 minutes ago. And you'll notice some of these colors, these deep maroons and the reds, are some really high rainfall rates. So if that portion of the storm was to stay over that one spot for an hour, it would produce about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of rain, which is a lot of moisture for us. It's a bit of a different different view here in Boise, where we continue to see those showers. Thunderstorms will linger the rest of tonight.
All right, let's get to your comments for today. This one from Kip. What an incompetent mess with the ITD site. State employees who worked the sale of property should be appreciated for their efforts despite overreaching government intervention. Brilliant work by the legislature to find another possible way to spend taxpayer dollars on a legal defense. Reneging on the ITD sale, says Jack in Boise. Our legislators had enough money to cover litigation when the buyers sue the state. How much will that save? Asked Jose in Caldwell. Not to mention the money already spent to kind of move them into where they are up on the Chinden campus, the former HP site or current HP site. They've spent a lot of money to move some of their facilities up there already. So that's money already spent, and they're going to have to pay now to move back into there if this thing goes through. Rick, I'm guessing library bills came from Bill Mills. Rick may not know, but I can tell you this. That one, the Idaho Family Policy Center supported that, which is part of a bigger network. So yes, basically, sure, that's where that came from as well. We'll see if the governor signs that one. We'll see you tomorrow.